In the Horn of Africa, Somalis and Ethiopians have been fighting it out in a bitter war that's now lasted 2 months. It's a situation well symbolized in this victory pose by a Somali soldier. For the Ethiopian lion really has been crushed underfoot in this, Africa's latest war. It's been happening in the Ogaden in eastern Ethiopia. Casualties on both sides have already run into thousands. Material damage has been enormous, and there's a very real danger that the major powers could be involved. It's a war over frontiers. According to the Somalis, the Ogaden belongs not in eastern Ethiopia, but in western Somalia. It is, in fact, just a part of Somalia's wider claims to territory in northern Kenya and Djibouti. If the claims were met, they would double Somalia's area and population, making it one of the major powers in this strategically crucial area. But the Somalis believe that only by redrawing artificial colonial boundaries can they achieve the true outline of their nation. It's certainly true that the people of the Ogaden are mainly Somali in culture and language. Most are nomads. The area takes its name from one of the main nomadic tribes. And they've used this whole area as a grazing ground for centuries, with no regard for boundaries either national or international. Until quite recently, there were few frontiers to ignore, for those of the British and Italian colonizers were lines drawn on a map rather than on the ground. Things began to change in the 1950s when the Ethiopians strengthened their grip on the area by building military garrisons. In 1960, an organized liberation movement was formed. But the Ogaden remained a relatively peaceful place until 2 years ago, when guerrilla activity sharply increased. And then in July this year, the guerrillas launched their all-out attack. Last month, they invited members of the international press to come and see the extent of their victories. A roving report was there. This was Fiercest, a border post between Somalia and Ethiopia. But any sign of an Ethiopian presence had disappeared. The flag that was flying was that of the West Somalia Liberation Front. There was little doubt about how the local population felt about the changeover. They'd lived their life under Ethiopian rule, but the people used Somali to express their feelings now. Hadau Mengistu, down with President Mengistu of Ethiopia. The people's hatred for their former rulers was so intense, it was sometimes difficult to judge quite where it would end. Everywhere we went, it was the same story, with the Liberation Front's guerrillas very much in evidence. The front claims it's got as many as 6,000 guerrillas under arms. We weren't able to confirm that, but as we were driven further into Ethiopian territory, we could see the front was in control of everything, except perhaps the emotional and often chaotic reception we got from the people themselves. people's excitement wasn't the only recurring theme. The other one was the destruction that the fighting had left behind. This had been a store of food, emergency supplies sent in after the disastrous drought of 2 years ago, which killed many of the nomads and sent others fleeing to the towns and villages. In the wake of destruction, though, the means to rebuild, or at least to restock. These are traders from Mogadishu, following hard on the heels of the victorious guerrillas. It's an indication of just how quickly the area is being brought into the Somali fold. The key to the Ethiopian collapse in the Ogaden lies here at Godey, almost 200 kilometers from the Somali border. Here, amid the poverty of the surrounding areas, the Ethiopians built an airbase with a runway big enough to take a jumbo jet. Godey was Ethiopia's most important base in the Ogaden. It fell on July 24th after artillery fire destroyed the command post. There were 5,000 Ethiopians stationed here. Those who weren't killed fled, leaving behind them a vast store of arms and ammunition, most of it supplied by the United States. These are supplies that had been stockpiled by Ethiopia since relations between Addis and Washington were finally broken by the Ethiopians in February this year. Ethiopia's now turned to the Soviet Union for arms, but there was no sign here that arms from the new alliance had got through to the front. Russia's long been a supplier to Somalia, so it's now arming both sides in the conflict. Among the larger items, a British-made anti-aircraft gun. This is one of 3 the Ethiopians left behind. Somalia and Ethiopia are both among the world's poorer nations, but the weapons captured by each side clearly show that military spending has been enormous. The Ethiopian collapse has been not only expensive, but also somewhat humiliating for a nation with almost 10 times the population of its enemy and with twice as many troops. The Somalis believe their success is due not to better equipment, but to the justice of their cause. Here's the Liberation Front's commander at Godey.
It was possible to capture this airbase because we have attacked from all sides. Also because we were fighting with very strong determination and with a will. So we were studying for a very long time how to conquer, this very strong base. And we had information, this territory or this area are inhabited by our people, and always it helped us, So we used to get information about the type of weapons, you see, and the base, the setup and the strategy of this base. At the same time, we have tried that the inhabitants or the civilian people should not be killed under crossfire.
So what is going to happen with West Somalia when the fighting is over?
maxaad malaynaysaa in ayaha dambe dalka kan Soomaalida galbeed uu noqonayo marka dagaalku u dhamaado?
Hadda waxaan ku jirnaa xoreyntii dalka.
Now we are in the process of liberating our territory, which is not yet finished. The destiny of this nation will be decided later on by the people and by the Central Committee of the Liberation Movement. Now we are...
The Somalis' prize exhibit at Godey is the villa of the region's Ethiopian governor. Now riddled with bullets, it once served Emperor Haile Selassie as a summer residence. The villa was attacked 12 days before the base. These bloodstains are claimed by the guerrillas to belong to von Rosen, the Swedish count who was one of the founders of Ethiopia's air force. further still into conquered territory and the same ferocious hatred, which makes it difficult to believe that Ethiopians can ever again rule here. On the road to Kebri, Dehar, the wreck of an Ethiopian Airlines DC-3 shot down by the guerrillas' guns. Ethiopia claimed one of its civilian DC-3s had been carrying women and children away from the war zone when it was shot down. It's not certain whether this is the plane in question. Kebri Dehar itself was another important Ethiopian garrison of roughly the same size as Ogaden. It fell 3 days later. Here too, the wreckage bears witness to the scope of Ethiopia's military investment in the Ogaden. At the ruined police post, the scattered documents of the former regime. The Somalis claim all this shows that Ethiopia's presence in the Ogaden was that of an army of occupation and not an accepted civilian administration. On a captured tank, the emblem of St. George, a reminder of the Christian faith which also sets Ethiopia apart from Somalia. These Ethiopian tanks were taken by surprise. Their crews were having a meal in a nearby hut when the guerrillas struck. Now they're buried in shallow graves beside their wrecked vehicles. Kebri Dehar is now an important training center for the Liberation Front. While the experienced troops are away at the war, local youths are formed into home guard units. There's a similar effort on the political front, as committees of liberation are set up in every conquered area. The Ethiopians claim they've been fighting Somali regulars, but both Mogadishu and the Liberation Front strongly deny it. The front says any officers who were in Somalia's regular army have resigned their commissions, and that it couldn't really use troops from outside the Ogaden, as they'd be unfamiliar with the area's geography and conditions, and would take too long to train in guerrilla ways. The town of Jaladi fell the same day as Kebri Dehar. Now the Italian-built fort houses 200 Ethiopian prisoners of war. They were under strict guard, and we were not allowed to talk to them. There's so much hatred on both sides in this war that the number of prisoners taken has been less than it might have been. It's estimated the Ethiopians lost at least 8,000 men in the July offensive, and Somali losses are also in the thousands. More recent battles in the north around Jijiga and Harar are said to have caused even greater carnage. According to latest reports, Jijiga has fallen to the Somalis, but fighting is still going on in the area. The Ethiopians admit at least 60% of the Ogaden is now in Somali hands. The Somalis claim it's more like 90%. For the nomads, life goes on very much as usual, but there are some important changes. Under Ethiopian rule, for example, they were sometimes under pressure to cooperate with the military against the guerrillas. Failure to cooperate meant the threat of a blocked-up well. But from what we saw and heard, it seemed that the nomads' allegiance was firmly with the guerrillas. All over Somalia, the Mogadishu government is trying to persuade the nomads to settle down. We asked this couple how they saw their life changing now the Ethiopians had gone.
We did not have life at the beginning when the Ethiopian occupation were here. For instance, this well, which is called Warder, used to be prevented from our camels to be watered. The Ethiopians used to blackmail us and told us that if you don't collaborate, your camels will not drink from here. So that wasn't a life. Now we are independent, we are free, we have liberated our country, and you can see we are watering our camels here.
And will you continue to be nomads?
We are going to settle down, you see, and change our lives, you know. Although we like our camels, but we would like to develop this country so as to settle down.
In Ethiopia, the course of the war in the Ogaden has been felt as a shattering blow. The government's already fighting a major civil war in Eritrea, and there are other rebellions elsewhere in the country. President Mengistu's latest move has been to call up all former soldiers up to the age of 60. That's on top of the so-called People's Army of enlisted civilians. Ethiopians are donating blood and giving up to 10% of their salaries to buy supplies for the troops. And President Mengistu has warned that the sacrifices won't stop there. The crisis has come on the third anniversary of the revolution which brought the military government to power, and President Mengistu celebrated with an exhibition of photographs showing what the country was like before the revolution. The aim was clearly to show Ethiopians just how much they had gained from the revolution, and to warn them that they would have to fight hard to retain what they had won. This is Dawa, Ethiopia's Eastern Front headquarters and the main base for its air raids against the guerrillas. It's the largest town in RR province and the third largest town in the whole country. Last month it nearly fell to the guerrillas, but the Ethiopians held onto it after a fierce battle. The Ethiopians claim that MiG fighters and tanks from Somalia's regular army were used in the battle. The captured equipment, which they later showed the press, was certainly not the normal weaponry of a guerrilla-style liberation movement. The Ethiopians say 10 Soviet-built Somali tanks were captured intact and are now in use against the enemy. Despite this victory, many Ethiopians wonder what chance their own hastily trained People's Army has against experienced and well-armed guerrillas or Somali regulars. The battle for Dawa lasted 2 days. According to the Ethiopian commander, the Somalis had used 1 motorized battalion, 1 armored battalion, and 2 battalions of artillery backed up by rocket launchers. 4,000 Somali soldiers had been engaged. Of these, he claimed, 700 had been killed. Although the war's not going their way, the Ethiopians are determined to hold on. If they lose Ogaden, they know that the rebels in Eritrea and elsewhere will fight with even greater determination, and that could mean the dissolution of Ethiopia as it is today. In Mogadishu, the Ogaden War has brought both triumphs and problems. The main problem is arms. Shipments are still coming in, mainly from Arab countries, but those from Somalia's chief supplier, the Soviet Union, are virtually at a standstill now that the Russians have transferred their support to Ethiopia. There are still some 6,000 Soviet advisors in Somalia. Normally they work all over the country, but according to latest reports, many of them have been recalled to the capital for security reasons. Among the people, anti-Russian feeling is high, but the government is playing it cooler. Somalia has been a Soviet client for many years and has nothing to gain and a great deal to lose by a permanent breach with Moscow. For a while, it looked as if America's President Carter would step in with arms for Somalia, thus making the shift in allegiances complete. But the Americans now seem to have backed off, along with other Western nations. President Bahrain recently paid an unpublicized trip to Moscow in the hope of retaining the Soviet links, but there's been no word about the outcome. Incidentally, the president's own family comes from the Ogaden. Throughout the war, Somalia has insisted that although it's supporting the Liberation Front, it's not itself at war with Ethiopia. The last time the two nations did clash directly was in 1964, and on that occasion, only American influence prevented the Ethiopians from marching right across Somalia. The Liberation Front itself has its main headquarters in Mogadishu, and it's here that the front's leaders, such as Abdullahi Hassan, have been giving daily press conferences on the progress of the war. The front, of course, agrees with Somalian government statements about who's running the war, but it's still not saying anything about what comes next, whether it's independence for the Ogaden or simply autonomy within the framework of a greater Somalia. In the meanwhile, there's been little support for the struggle in the rest of Africa. An OAU tribunal has ruled in Ethiopia's favor, and most African nations look on the prospect of a breakaway Ogaden with alarm. They feel that however unjust the colonial boundaries may be, it's too late now to try to change them. And though this flag means victory for the West Somalis, for the continent as a whole, it could well mean disaster.
Somali win.